My coding screen. Hey everyone, welcome to this video on 10 tips for writing clean and maintainable code. As developers, we all know how important it is to write code that is easy to read, understand, and modify. In this video, I'll share some practical tips that can help you write better code and make your life as a developer easier. So, without further ado, let's get started. Tip number 1. Use meaningful names. When naming variables, functions, classes, or any other code element, make sure the name reflects its purpose and meaning. Avoid using single-letter variables or cryptic names, as they can make the code hard to understand and maintain. Tip number 2. Write self-documenting code. Good code should be self-documenting, meaning that it should be clear and concise enough to explain itself without the need for additional comments. Use meaningful names, follow a consistent coding style, and break your code into smaller, reusable functions to make it more readable and maintainable. Tip number 3. Keep it simple. Simplicity is key when it comes to writing good code. Avoid overcomplicating your code with unnecessary features or abstractions. Keep your code focused and concise, and don't try to solve every problem at once. Tip number 4. Use comments wisely. While self-documenting code is great, sometimes you may need to add comments to explain complex algorithms or business logic. When writing comments, use clear and concise language, and avoid stating the obvious. Also, make sure to keep your comments up to date with the code changes. Tip number 5. Write modular code. Modular code is code that is organized into small, independent modules that can be easily understood and reused. By breaking your code into smaller, more manageable parts, you can make it easier to maintain, test, and debug. Tip number 6. Be consistent. Consistency is key when it comes to writing clean and maintainable code. Use the same coding style throughout your codebase, and follow common conventions and best practices. This will help make your code more readable and predictable for other developers. Tip number 7. Write tests. Writing automated tests is a great way to ensure that your code works as intended and is maintainable over time. By writing tests, you can catch bugs early, prevent regressions, and improve the overall quality of your code. Tip number 8. Refactor regularly. Refactoring is the process of improving the structure, design, and quality of your code without changing its functionality. By regularly refactoring your code, you can keep it clean and maintainable, and prevent technical debt from building up. Tip number 9. Use version control. Version control is a must-have tool for any software project. By using version control, you can track changes to your code, collaborate with other developers, and revert changes if needed. Make sure to use a version control system like Git from the very beginning of your project. Tip number 10. Learn from others. Last but not least, always be open to learning from others. Read code written by other developers, attend conferences and meetups, and participate in online communities. By learning from others, you can improve your coding skills and write better code. Closing shot of the computer screen with code on it. That's it for this video on 10 tips for writing clean and maintainable code. I hope you found these tips helpful, and that you can apply them in your own coding projects. If you have any other tips or suggestions, feel free to share them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and happy coding! Tip number 11. Avoid magic numbers and strings. Magic numbers and strings are hard-coded values that are used throughout the codebase without any explanation. They make the code harder to understand and maintain and can lead to bugs if they are changed accidentally. Instead, use constants or enums to give these values meaningful names and make them easier to understand. Tip number 12. Keep functions small and focused. Functions should be small and focused on doing one thing well. This makes them easier to understand, test, and reuse. If a function is too long or complex, consider breaking it down into smaller, more manageable functions. Tip number 13. Use error handling and logging. Error handling and logging are essential for writing robust and maintainable code. Make sure to handle errors gracefully, and log relevant information to help with debugging later on. Also, use appropriate logging levels to avoid cluttering your logs with unnecessary information. Tip number 14. Don't repeat yourself. Dry. The dry principle states that you should avoid duplicating code or logic in multiple places. Instead, extract common functionality into reusable functions or classes, and use them throughout your codebase. This makes your code more maintainable and less prone to errors. Tip number 15. Keep security in mind. Security should be a top priority when writing code, especially for web applications or systems that handle sensitive data. Make sure to use secure coding practices, such as input validation, secure storage of passwords and keys, and protection against common attacks like SQL injection and cross-site scripting, XSS. Tip number 16. Use design patterns. Design patterns are reusable solutions to common software design problems. By using design patterns, you can make your code more modular, flexible, and maintainable. Familiarize yourself with common design patterns like the singleton, factory, and observer patterns, and use them where appropriate. Tip number 17. Optimize for readability, not performance. While performance is important, it should not come at the expense of readability and maintainability. Don't sacrifice code clarity or modularity for the sake of performance, unless it is absolutely necessary. Instead, focus on writing readable and maintainable code first, and optimize for performance only when you have identified a bottleneck. Tip number 18. Follow the principle of least astonishment. The principle of least astonishment states that a program should behave in a way that is consistent with the user's expectations. In other words, the code should be intuitive and easy to understand, so that the user is not surprised by unexpected behavior. When designing your code, try to put yourself in the user's shoes and think about how they will interact with your program. Tip number 19. Use meaningful comments. When you do need to use comments, make sure they are meaningful and add value to the code. Avoid comments that simply duplicate what the code is doing, or that state the obvious. Instead, use comments to explain why the code is doing something, or to provide context or background information that is not immediately obvious from the code. Tip number 20. Use a style guide. A style guide is a set of standards and best practices for writing code. By following a style guide, you can ensure that your code is consistent and easy to read, even if multiple developers are working on the same codebase. There are many popular style guides available for different programming languages, such as the Google Java Style Guide or the PEP 8 Style Guide for Python. Tip number 21. Use descriptive commit messages. When you commit changes to your codebase, use descriptive commit messages that explain what you changed and why. This makes it easier for other developers to understand the changes and track the history of the codebase. Avoid generic commit messages like fixed a bug or added some code. Tip number 22. Use a linter. A linter is a tool that analyzes your code for potential errors and stylistic issues. By using a linter, you can catch errors and enforce coding standards before they cause problems. Many popular programming languages have linters available, such as Pylint for Python or ESLint for JavaScript. Tip number 23. Test for edge cases. When writing tests, make sure to test for edge cases and corner cases, as well as the typical behavior of the code. Edge cases are inputs or scenarios that are unlikely to occur, but can cause problems if they are not handled correctly. Testing for edge cases can help you catch bugs and ensure that your code is robust and reliable. Tip number 24. Continuously improve. Finally, remember that writing clean and maintainable code is an ongoing process. There is always room for improvement, and you should strive to continuously learn and grow as a developer. Keep up with the latest trends and best practices, and be open to feedback and constructive criticism.